Let's talk about unlocking the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers. Here's a quote from Drucker. I really like this quote. Found it, many years ago. Workers are knowledge workers if they know more about the work they perform than their bosses. Wow. What does that say? It says, that's pretty interesting. It says if I'm a manager and I have 5 knowledge workers, each of whom knows more about the work than I do, how do I manage that? Well, you kind of got to throw in the towel, right? You can't manage that. You can lead it, but it can't be managed because you're managing work that you don't understand. It's going to make you just seem and feel incompetent. And we also know about knowledge workers that they are themselves best placed to make decisions about how to perform their work. They know more about their work after all. They have local context and local knowledge. So when we make decisions for them, when we make central decisions over their local decisions, that's pretty silly because the person that made the decision is not the best place to be able to do that. We also know they must be heard and respected. Inspect and adapt. If they say, this is hurting us, this doesn't work, as managers and leaders, we're going to have to take that to task. We're going to have to be serious about addressing that. They have to manage themselves. They have to have autonomy. That's the second time in 4 or 5 slides that we've seen the word autonomy. This is important to them. This is how they improve their outcomes. This is not a carrot and stick situation. And innovation, that's not an ad hoc thing. That's not, oh, by the way, don't forget to innovate. We have to provide opportunities for innovation. It has to be part of their work. It has to be part of the task and the basic responsibility of knowledge workers. Now, your leadership style is going to be one of the things that determine the effectiveness. And leadership styles vary. And I'm going to describe 3 here, and some might seem less interesting or less exciting than others. They're not designed to be that way. We're going to discuss from this book, recommended reading, Managing for Excellence, the notion of leader as expert, the notion of leader as conductor, and the notion of leader as developer of people. And we're going to discuss each of these attributes and see what we can learn about them. Let's talk about leader as expert. This can be very effective when the manager has greater knowledge than direct reports. Well, why can it be effective? Because they might know a lot more about the solution than the knowledge worker currently knows. I was a knowledge worker in that space, and I'm an expert. That's not all bad. So what are the characteristics? A technician or master craftsman, they were promoted because they were the best at their job. That's not a bad thing. Beats being promoted because they were the worst at their job. They're the problem solvers, the one people go to for answers, and they understand the domain and the technology. But they define their work, it's when people leave them alone. So if you see or work with a leader, a manager, who feels like he or she does their best work when they're left alone, that's a characteristic of that leader as expert. Well, it's not a terrible thing. I would hate to think that competence has become all of a sudden a bad deal, but there are some specific challenges with that. And it tends to limit the learning and growth of direct reports. How come? Because we have the knowledge. I'll simply tell you the knowledge. I don't need to go out and discover it on my own. My boss is going to tell me the knowledge. And I'll trust that to a certain point. But it's not my experience. I didn't grow that knowledge. It was stuck in there by someone else. And it tends to focus on technical problems because that's what they do. Well, what about the human factors? What about the fact that, I'm sorry, I have a real weakness in that area. I can't really address that. So there are some challenges with leader as expert for sure. Now I'm going to suggest something for you to do here that I think you'll quite enjoy. I can't, obviously, for many reasons, I can't include that video here. But I'm going to ask you to go to YouTube or Google The Knack by Dilbert, okay? And this is a video about leader as expert. It's not really structured as leader as expert, but it's going to be a kick. It's only, I think, 3 minutes long. And what it tells you is that all other things being equal, these experts may be cut from a slightly different cloth, and they may not be cut from the same cloth that's most effective to lead others. And we've seen that. We've seen highly technically competent people whose work is when people leave them alone. And by that definition, are they going to be the best manager you ever had? Not necessarily. That's a concern. The second model to discuss is leader as conductor. I did software development for maybe almost a decade, but within that time I met people who were frankly a lot better at it than I was, and at that point that was end of career for me. Once I met people who were better than I was. So I moved into a different model. Basically, I became the CEO, my first company. I was still a fairly young whippersnapper, if you will, at the time. And because I didn't have really the technical leadership skills necessarily, my code wasn't the best. I led in different ways. And the way I led was to start coordinating the build out of a larger company. And the characteristics of this leader as conductor role, it's not a bad thing, by the way. It's very successful at this. It was a great company. Central decision maker, nerve center coordinator, they would definitely say that that was me. I orchestrated all individual parts of the organization in a harmonious whole. That's what I did. I conducted all of that. I put this part together and had this person conduct this, and I knew all the ins and outs, and I could get people to work together and get things done. But I was the center hub for that. Subtle and indirect manipulation of their solution. Let me tell you a secret. I think if I asked some of my peers from 20 years ago or some of my direct reports, they would say, hey, Dean, there was nothing particularly subtle or indirect about what you were doing there. Okay, well, we learn and we grow, and probably if I had to do that over again, I would. But I don't have it to do over again. I have it to do over again in my new world, and I'm trying to be better at that, but we have our experiences behind us and we have our predilections. Manage across individuals, teams, and departments. That's what a coordinator does. Lots of things to coordinate out there. Printed circuit design department, printed circuit board prototyping department, the fabrication plant, the manufacturing plant, the software that went on the printed circuit board, where we get the stuff from the suppliers. You know, kind of project manager extraordinaire, bringing all that stuff together, coordinating the company. Wasn't a bad thing. It was a very successful company. I'm certainly proud of that. But my work was coordinating others. So my work wasn't anymore waking up and saying, hey, get out of my office. It was, everybody's in my office all the time. I'm coordinating their work, and I'm there in their office as well. It's not a bad thing. It's very effective. Great company. But, and here's the but, many challenges associated with this model. Tends to narrow the focus of direct reports to their own areas. So if I interviewed those people, and many of them with me are with me even now in my later companies, I might say, hey, would you be interested in joining a new venture? And I think it's fair to say that most of them would say, absolutely, let's do it. And can we have coffee? And what are they saying? Absolutely, I'm in. Can we talk a bit about leadership and the way I've grown and the way that I hope you've grown, so that you can provide a much stronger and more capable leadership, and frankly provide more autonomy, more intellectual freedom, and more authority in the new organization than I had in the last. So I'm coming, but we need to chat. And the challenge there is that conflict tends to push upward, looking for the boss to fix. And you actually hire people and grow people in a way that says, if it's a big problem, we'll go ask the boss. Right? Dean can do it, let's go ask Dean. Not a good model, right? Those need to be solved locally. If there's interpersonal conflict, there are real challenges, most of those should be solved locally. That's self-organizing and self-managing, but you don't have that model as a conductor. And those folks use systems and procedures to control work, and I certainly did. As the company grew, I worked harder and harder, and nobody really realized their full potential. And as we grew in the next stage, I actually made a hire. I hired somebody, a brilliant person, MIT grad, really technically competent and very procedurally oriented. And his view was, as we grew, we need to document more systems and procedures to control the work. And thus started a really tough 4 or 5 year spiral of, while the company was growing, the culture wasn't working as well as it could have. And that was a key mistake. And if I had to do it over again, I would do that different, because I would recognize these models and say, wow, I'm fairly conductory anyway. I tend to want to have these things under control. I don't want to balance myself with somebody that's even more oriented towards systems and procedures. I want to balance myself with somebody that wants to empower others and grow. And that leads us to this trap of the good leader myth responsibility trap. And I think that's particularly pernicious in kind of the U.S. economic corporate system, where, you know, the CEO is the boss and they own all the problems, and that means that they feel over responsible for everything. I can handle the pressure, I'll coordinate, I'll provide the answers. The direct reports feel over controlled, blocked and underused, and committed only to the sub goals. Because this guy's taking care of my unit goals, I'll just do my sub goal. And they don't have the commitment and sense of responsibility they deserve. So they're not growing as fast as they could. So what are we doing? We're failing to grow the people as fast as we could. And that's a negative reinforcing cycle. It doesn't make the full use of the knowledge and competencies of direct reports, and it can produce narrow and self-interested direct reports, because my only area is this one. So we're not supermen, we're just people. I've been a CEO or executive almost all my career. I'm just a guy trying to do my best like everybody else, and I am not Superman. There's no S on my chest. Occasionally it's like B for bozo that made that really big mistake, okay? It's just me trying to grow and build the company. So I want to get out of that mode. I want to move out of that. Let's talk about a third model, leader as developer of people. Let's escape that heroic trap with a post-heroic, a much leaner leadership style. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that leaders expert is a bad thing. I like hanging around people that are distinctly competent. If I had to choose, all other things being equal, I would choose a boss that had tremendous competence in the domain because I can learn from that person. That's not bad. I don't mind a leader that also can coordinate and get things done in this organization. At the same time, what I really want my leader to do is help develop my skills so that I can grow. So let's escape that trap. And as developer people, it's slightly different. We create teams that are jointly responsibility for success. You know, there's the idiom, there's no I in team. Leader asks a question: how can each problem be solved in a way that further develops my people's commitments and capabilities? How can we grow in this problem? How can the team address the problem? Why is this problem on my desk? Have you tried a couple ways? What problem-solving techniques can we use to address that? And work is now developing other people's abilities. So leader as developer people comes in every day and says, I know what my work is. It's not to retire to my office and do technical work. It's not to wander around necessarily and coordinate other activities. It's to find the shiny spots where people are ready to grow and figure out what I can do to allow them to grow and to increase their skills and capabilities. This is not a zero-sum game. We've talked about plenty of zero-sum games like budgets and capacity allocation. This is not one. Everyone can have more power and more capability in the enterprise. And if you're in a competitive environment, the more you have, the better leverage you're going to have to compete against whoever that competitor is. So there's no downside to this. Work is developing others' abilities. And that gives us increased responsibility from our direct reports, increased employee engagement, higher motivation, better morale. And by the way, it frees me as a leader to spend more time managing laterally and upward. So if I'm not responsible for, for telling individuals on a team what to do day to day, I might have a chance to read a book about how to be a better coach. Maybe I'll become a scrum master to help my teams meet their goals, or spend my time with my peers or my bosses helping proselytize and talk a little bit about the successes we're having in Lean and Agile, because we're no longer tied directly to the day-to-day task activities and the individuals. There's no limit to the power of getting things done. Create an environment of mutual influence. So this is part of our building, unlocking intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers. And we need to create a safe environment, no pun intended, for learning, growth, and mutual influence. And this is an interesting vignette, one of the many true stories. This is Garth Andrews, one of our SBCs. Right now, I think he runs the global PMO at Elekta, which is an international healthcare conglomerate. And at the time, he was an Agile coach. He was a coach's coach. He was an enterprise coach. And he took me into one of his companies. The company, I'll tell you who the company was. The company was NetApp. And he said, we've had a really good time in this division developing the Lean Agile paradigm. And we have this trophy. And this is a coveted trophy. And this is a horse. Ooh, it's not quite a horse. This is the back end of a horse. This is the horse's rear award, okay? So I thought that was kind of fascinating. And I said, well, why do you do that? And he said, well, we need to create a safe environment. People need to be able to make mistakes, and we need to be able to laugh about that. I then joined a forum the next day with a bunch of folks on the podium, and unbeknownst to me, one of them was the vice president of NetApp. So I told this story and showed the picture and thought it was pretty funny, and then I noticed that he was the vice president of NetApp, and I started to have palpitations because, oh my goodness, what have I done here now? And we introduced ourselves on the panel, and we got to his point, and he said, I don't remember his name. He said, I'm such and such. I'm a vice president of NetApp. And he looked at me, and he looked at Garth in the audience, and he said, I'm the proud 2-time recipient of the Horse's Ass Award. And everybody in the room laughed. And I tell that story in every one of my trainings. I then ask people to raise your hands if you would work for that guy. And the hands shoot up like a rocket. Now, if that same leader has never received the Horse's Ass Award or has never volunteered for it, it's typically volunteered, not given. Would you work for that person? Not so sure. So in order to create an environment where people can grow, we will encourage our direct reports to disagree where appropriate. It's okay to argue. I argue to think. My team, sometimes it drives them crazy, sometimes they totally get it. Advocate for the positions they believe in. Just because I'm a boss or supervisor, that does not make my opinion more important. Rarely, if ever, do I pull my opinion out of the hat and simply impose it on others. Not that kind of leader. Push for their own needs. If this is important, you let me know. enter into joint problem solving, and negotiate, compromise, agree, and commit. And this is the style of creating an environment of mutual influence where, is everybody equal? Well, not exactly. Pay is not necessarily equal. Reporting is not exactly equal. Maybe resources given aren't exactly equal, but they're equal in one way, which is their intellectual contribution is valued and trusted and contributes to the ongoing growth of all. Their knowledge becomes shared knowledge and we all grow together. So that's my quick and fun story on the Horse's Rear Award. In this exercise, we're going to ask you to stop and read the article, Leadership is a Task Rather Than an Identity. You can download that article on the framework site, scaledagileframework.com/LSarticles. Take 5 minutes, hit pause right now, underline any sentences that you find interesting or thought-provoking. Share it with your peers if you can, or if your peers aren't around right now, share it back to me. So in a second, I'll go to the whiteboard here and let's talk about some of the learnings that I find in that article. And I'll just kind of replay the vignettes that we learn about in class and tell you some of the stories that support this really interesting and far more dynamic view of leadership. So go ahead, stop, read that, and then join me at the whiteboard. We talked about various leadership styles as articulated in the book. We talked about leader as expert, leader as conductor, and leader as developer of people. And I think we roughly came to the conclusion that when you're working with knowledge workers, the bottom, the last one of the third, leader as developer of people is the right thing. This article takes, frankly, a startlingly different view. And it didn't start out, of course, in the Agile world. A friend of mine introduced me to this article some years ago, and I've kept it with me ever since. And it talks about a different thing. It talks about leadership as a task and the dynamic nature of leadership in online gaming. So I have the students read back to me and underline a specific phrase or sentence they found meaningful. And some of the highlights include the following. You've probably found those too. Leaders have exceptional relationship skills. Good game leaders have exceptional relationship skills. Leadership as a task, that's the name of the article actually. Non-monetary incentives are motivational. Knowledge of player skills. Choice of who will lead is organically made. Perhaps the right environment is what really matters. Gamifying the work environment and kind of the pithy takeaway for when the gamers were talking to the HBR guys about if you want better leaders, why not change the game? And one more, hyper-transparency of a wide range of information. Okay. Now, I like to conclude, if you will, after this brief story. Well, I'll come back to that. We'll just go on with the story. Remember the shock effect of the quasi-self-organizing nature of that large Agile release train, the team that was struggling to deliver value. So let's return to that story, and let me come back a couple days later. And what we had taught them during our training was very simple. We're going to get to the point where we have a committed set of PI objectives, release objectives in that case, and we're going to leave here and you're going to go back, and the first thing you're going to do is to plan your sprint. Very traditional Scrum. Teams get together, figure out their backlog, and go. So I came back the next week, and amazingly enough, went to the large room again, and all the teams were together in that room, and that was really strange because that's not what we had taught them. We hadn't said that let's just get everybody in a room again, but they were doing their sprint planning together. 100 people doing their sprint planning together, and we had no clue this was going to happen. So management was kind of concerned about the model because we hadn't coached that, and we didn't understand what their strategy was. So the teams were sitting there, and we bit our tongue and sat down to watch. So someone came up to the room, and he was obviously self-selected because he wasn't a Scrum Master product owner. I didn't remember talking to him specifically, and I had trained those roles, so it wasn't that. And he had a QVC T-shirt on, the American Shopping Channel. He had a T-shirt on. And he stood up and boldly declared, he said, you have a big backlog, right? Everybody has lots of stuff to do. And everybody said, yeah, we do. He said, not anymore. You're hereby relieved of all tasks and responsibilities. And people are kind of stunned by that. And he said, the change control board that we've established to vector the defects that come in through the system, we eliminated that change control board Friday night. And the people are still here, don't get me wrong, that's Bill and Sue or whatever, but they're not going to operate in a change control board anymore because we've got product owners now. And let's see, what else? I think that's about it. So that's really it, except he said, I do have here pretty long list of defects, as you're well aware, that we need to resolve. So let's just figure out what we can do about these defects. So you have no current backlog responsibilities right now. The teams have no real backlog, except we have some here. And he said, look at this defect. This is defect number 163. It's pretty well formed. I look at the penmanship on that. That seems to be seems probably even reproducible. This defect says the following. And somebody in the room said, I'm pretty sure that's in my code area. I think I know what that is. And he said, okay. And he handed that one off. So that person took that particular defect. And then he proceeded down the path a little bit further. Defect number such and such and such and such. And somebody said, I think that's in the code base. I'm familiar with that code base. I think that the guy that wrote that code isn't here anymore, but I'm pretty familiar. I think I can handle that. And he volunteered. He took that defect. And this went on for about maybe 30 or 40 minutes. Now, we had coached them to, as you have seen, the iteration planning, sprint planning, no more than 4 hours. Well, we're about 30 or 35 minutes, and he's gotten his pile work down. He's still got a lot left. And then he gets to a point where it reminds me of that scene in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, one of my daughter's favorite movies, where the instructor's in front of the class and he's asking for a response from the teams. And he said, defect number 633. Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Anyone? Nobody's taking the defects. So he looked over at his peers, some of the Scrum Masters and product owners and other leaders in the organization. And said, okay, we're good to go. Iteration planning is over. Oh, I forgot one thing, by the way. If you can't reproduce a defect in less than 4 hours, okay, close it in Quality Center. I'm sitting next to the quality manager, and she had quite a reaction to that. She said, well, but how do you know that defect is gone? Well, you don't really, but at least it gave them a way to handle non-reproducibles, get them off of the backlog, and quit worrying about it. Now, for those of you in the code base thinking, a little broader terms, what happens with a defect that you close out that's still there? It's going to come back. That's okay. But at least we're not worried about things that happened 6 months ago that's probably been fixed by now. We're not going to spend any time chasing that out. So they created a quantitative way to handle the imponderable. Now, I would have never thought of that. I wouldn't have been bold enough to do that. So think about that for a second. Now, by the way, they did indeed perform, and Agile was a huge benefit to that organization, and they ended up with a really, really solid release, almost belying the fact that you can't kind of, fix defect your way back to quality. The reality is it was a really, really great release. So that meant that there was some good, solid architectural underpinnings to the solution. So the story turned out really well, turned into just a great effort and a great result. But now let's talk about the process a little bit. We didn't teach them to plan their sprints together. We didn't teach them to eliminate the change control board. We didn't teach them that let's just forget the backlog and just start whacking out defects as fast as we can. We said we're going to plan the sprint and make commitments to the sprint. What had we really done? Now, they hadn't had any of this. So we didn't do leadership as a task. So who was this leader? Who stepped up? Non-monetary incentives, definitely no monetary incentives associated with that. They actually eliminated monetary incentives. The choice of who will lead was made organically by the group. Exceptional relationship skills, hyper-transparency of information. Here's some hyper-transparency. We have a ton of defects that we have to get solved to get our system to ship on time. Selectively gamifying the work environment. I know a lot of leaders and managers, we worry about that. It just doesn't seem like that's a mature and productive way or even a professional way to approach the system. We didn't teach them any of that. We didn't even have the discussion. They did it all. And they achieved it because what had we really done when we put them in a room and we said we're going to move to Agile methods? We have Agile teams now. We're allowing some amount of shuffling and reorientation. You're here to deliver the system. Do it however you can. Perhaps the right environment is what really matters. The next exercise is quite a fun one and kind of a conclusion to this part of the course and thereby the entire course. I talked about Drive earlier. I talked about Dan Pink's book, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. It's a fun and light read, but he's done a 12-minute video on 3 factors that lead to better performance and personal satisfaction. And it's called Autonomy, Mastery, and Purpose. So take a few minutes and watch that. It'll take about 12 minutes. And then when you're done, join me at the whiteboard for a discussion. I hope you found that video as interesting and frankly as compelling as I did. And I will tell you, That video isn't popular in every single circle. I got some feedback the other day that somebody taught Leading Safe, and they showed that video, and there was a vice president who hadn't been in attendance for much of the course, not surprisingly, and he watched the video and he stood up and he was apoplectic, frankly, and he said, I don't agree, this is not the way we operate here. We are a meritocracy, you know, we pay per performance, and you could just immediately see the pall that fell over the crowd when they realized that this guy didn't get the model, didn't understand the model, and didn't frankly believe in the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers. So we probably lost that gig, right? Probably I doubt that SAFE is going anywhere there, and nor is Agile or Lean or Scrum or anything else. So that's kind of sad. So maybe that's a bridge too far. Maybe we should take the video out. We're not going to take the video out. We think that video really tells the truth about the fact that our people come motivated to work, and we have a variety of things we can do to help them, most of which are demotivational. And we have some things that we can do that actually can incent and support their need for certain types of aspects of their working environment. And what were those three? Very simply, the first one was autonomy. And we've seen that word now, I'm not sure, 4 or 5 different times just through the leadership module alone. When you're working with knowledge workers, the desire to be self-directed, the desire to do this work in the best way we can is an intrinsic desire, really a critical desire for them to achieve their fullest potential. And the second was mastery. But interestingly enough, what he said in the video was a little beyond mastery. He said specifically, challenge and mastery and making a contribution. So when we're dealing with leaders and managers and change agents and folks in the enterprise that want to implement Lean Agile transformation, it's not a random thought. They simply want to improve outcomes. So what is motivating them? Why are they tilting against that windmill of the large enterprise with its existing corporate culture and its existing waterfall and its SDLC and its project-based funding? They want to make a contribution, right? Challenge and mastery and making a contribution drives them. And the last one is a sense of purpose. So we're going to keep promoting that video and keep talking about the intrinsic motivation of knowledge workers, because we think it's important that as leaders and managers, we move to this kind of next generation. This next generation of knowledge workers, they're different folks than the management style that I grew up with. And if we want to achieve the maximum employee engagement, have them really like their jobs. When people like their jobs, do they do better work? Of course they do. If we want to achieve that, we want to keep these 3 facets in mind: autonomy, mastery, challenge and mastery, and making a contribution, and a sense of purpose.